Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating an Effective Application Privacy Policy. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Today's webinar will be enhanced by your participation, so we encourage you to submit your questions via the Ask a Question button throughout the presentation today. We will answer as many questions as we have time for at the end. If you experience any audio issues during the session, please click the Rate This button on top of your player window and follow the instructions to receive help from the BrightTalk team. Just a reminder that this event will be on demand after the session has ended. Everyone in attendance will receive an email follow-up with a link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, as well as some additional resources based on today's topic. In the meantime, we invite you to follow our channel for access to upcoming events and additional on-demand content. So now let's get started by introducing today's presenter. Kevin Poniatowski is a Principal Security Engineer here at Security Innovation. Kevin brings an optimal blend of speaking ability, technical savvy, and an insatiable passion for security to Security Innovation's training customers. Since joining Security Innovation in 2007, he has split his time between the application security course development, delivering instructor-led courses, and driving our customer success program. And with that, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So I have been, teaching since 2007, so we're looking at 11.5 years of discussing application security and privacy topics. And over the past, I would say, year and a half, we're really seeing privacy starting to come to the forefront as organizations are recognizing that countries are passing legislation that is written to protect users and also to enforce how organizations handle the data that they are collecting from their users, whether it be personal identifiable information or even such information as a photo that a user may have uploaded to an organization's website. So that leads into, now that we understand that privacy is becoming a bigger and bigger deal to governments around the world, well, how do we create an effective application privacy policy? This is a responsibility that we just can't leave to a development team, because often developers are just unaware and don't have the subject matter expertise about the data that they are processing and storing, and they often don't have an awareness of the privacy implications of that data. What could possibly happen if the data that they are collecting and processing is shared with, let's say, a third-party marketing company? How do the laws affect that? So it's important to have an application privacy policy so that this is documented for your development team. It is documented so your users can understand it. So this is what we're going to go through today. And so we can start to get an understanding of how really important having an application privacy policy is. So we're going to jump back in time a little bit. And we have some legislation that's been passed in 2003 called the Online Privacy Act in the United States. And I'm going to use this example, and I have Facebook here as part of this example. It's easy to pile on Facebook because they're an enormous corporation, but I don't want to pile on Facebook here. I just want to take them as a lesson learned, because back in 2003, this is still really new, and we were still trying to find our way with how to protect consumers, how to protect users, and encourage organizations to keep their personal data private. So the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States ruled that Facebook deceived users by telling them that their data was private while sharing it more broadly. So let me actually dive a little deeper into this. And and kind of walk you through some of the mistakes that Facebook made so we can take it as a lesson learned and do our best to make sure this does not happen to our organization. So it all started, Facebook had changed its website so that certain information they had collected from users that had been designated as private from the users, like the user's friends list, was made public. And Facebook didn't warn the users that this change was coming or contact their users and get their approval in advance of this change. So some of the mistakes that Facebook made were Facebook represented by saying that third-party apps that users installed would have access only to user information that it absolutely needed to operate. But in fact, those apps could access nearly all of the user's personal data, even data the apps didn't need. Facebook also told their users they could restrict sharing of data to limited audiences by using the friends-only selection. However, in fact, when they user selected friends-only, it did not prevent their information from being shared with third-party applications their friends used, not just that they used, that their friends were using on Facebook. Facebook had a verified apps program, claimed it certified the security of those participating applications. That wasn't true. Facebook did not actually do that certification. Facebook promised users that it would not share their personal information with advertisers. It did, however. Facebook claimed that when users deactivated or deleted their accounts, their photos and videos would be inaccessible. However, you probably see where this is going. Facebook allowed access to this content even after users had deactivated or deleted their accounts. And then finally, Facebook had claimed that it complied with the United States and European Union's safe harbor framework that governs data transfer between the U.S. and the European Union. And it did not. So they really made a mess of that. So what ended up happening was Facebook did not receive a fine for kind of breaking all these promises. However, they were required to have third-party reviews for the next 20 years when it comes to handling this sensitive user data. So we want to make sure we avoid these kinds of issues. And so that's why I bring up Facebook here, is just to show that it's very easy to make mistakes when it comes to privacy, especially if we let a development team who hasn't been educated and trained on how our organization deals with privacy issues when it comes to our customer or users' data, that since the development team they're not subject matter experts, it's very easy to make mistakes. And so I come to you from a development background. I was a developer for over 10 years. And I wrote software for United States military pilots and navigators. And while I wrote software that helped those pilots and navigators plan their flights and their missions, I was not a subject matter expert at all about how to fly a plane or anything that involved with the information that plane needed to process while it was flying. So I was not a subject matter expert at all. And so it was easy to make assumptions that weren't true. Now, the ones that, a big assumption that I made that was absolutely incorrect was, now as a developer, and I don't want to dive too deep in the weeds here, but as a developer, you have to initialize your variables. And often that just means that you set a variable before it's going to be used to a value, a kind of a neutral value. So my variable was altitude, the altitude of the plane as it was sitting on, next to a landing strip. And I thought, well, 0 sounds like a good value there. It made perfect sense to me. Unfortunately, it was a terrible assumption because there are places in the world where 0 altitude is actually quite a bit above the ground, because it didn't occur to me at the time that there are places in the world that are below sea level that may have landing strips where planes might be sitting, and 0 would be way up high in the sky. I just made a bad assumption. So we want to make sure through the course of this webinar that we are helping you to lower the chances of having bad assumptions kind of introduce risk into your organization of possibly having a privacy violation. So there are a lot of legal requirements when it comes to creating privacy policies. And there are a lot of requirements that tell you when you need privacy policies. And it does deal a lot with the location of where you are, where your organization is headquartered, where your users are located. So here's some selections here where a legal requirement for a privacy policy is required if, one, you collect data from your users directly, or if you use third parties to collect data from your users. You may be required to have a privacy policy if you are selling a mobile app from the iOS App Store or the Android marketplace, or even within Windows. You are required to have a privacy policy if your users are located in the European Union according to GDPR, or if they're located in California or Australia or many other countries, or if you collect data on children or minors in California, or if you collect data on students, and on and on and on. So because so many countries and then even states or provinces within those countries may have data privacy laws that apply to your organization, so we just recommend it's just a good idea anyways to create a privacy policy so that we're erring on the side of caution, because regulations change, they're moving quickly, and we want to make sure that if something is coming down the road, we're actually being proactive about this. And also, if we are proactive about creating privacy policies, this can be reassuring to our users when we let them know, hey, we have a privacy policy and this is what we're doing for you to protect your information, and here's how we store it, and here's how long we'll store it, that kind of information. We'll get a little more into that later. So it's a good idea anyways. So as an example of some of the pending privacy legislation, this is within the United States. Now this is as of February 6th. I got this from an article. Now if you notice at the top of my slide, we have a little bit of a graphics artifact there in the top right-hand corner. I just double-checked my slide deck, which looks perfect. So we will be giving you the slide deck. We'll share that with you after the webinar today, and the text up there won't be screwed up. So I have no idea why that happened when I uploaded my slides. But getting into some of the pending legislation that is coming up, New York City has some legislation that requires a business to alert customers when using biometric identification technology like facial recognition software. The state of New York has legislation pending that requires businesses that retain personal user information to make details of what is held available on demand to the user, together with details of any third party through which that data may be shared. North Carolina, the Attorney General there just recently said that they have the intention to strengthen existing data breach notifications, which would include if a ransomware attack was successful and had somehow manipulated user data. You know, did it encrypt that data? Did it steal that data? And that's typically, ransomware is not usually included in data breach notification laws. Just a few others that we're seeing. Oregon introduces the Health Information Property Act, which actually increases the protections afforded by already federal HIPAA laws. So this even strengthens those laws. Utah introduced House Bill 57 providing privacy for digital communications. So if third parties wanted access to data your organization has been collecting from your users, it would require a warrant from a judge. Virginia is introducing House Bill 2793, which focuses on requiring care and disposal of customer records. So they would legislate, how long would an organization be allowed to store data, and what process would they need to go through for disposal of that data at the end of that data lifecycle. And then finally here, Washington introduces this Washington Privacy Act, where consumers will have the right to access personal data being held and can demand its deletion if it's no longer required for the purpose it was collected for. Kind of sounds like the GDPR's right to be forgotten. So this is just, the legislation that is coming down the road. Now, will all these be passed? Definitely not sure, but it's important that we understand that, laws are being written and discussed in legislative bodies around how organizations are collecting data and storing data and processing data. So this is just to help us really understand that if we don't have a privacy policy, a data privacy policy, we really need to start working on it now, so that, if these bills are passed and they do affect us, well, we've already have something in place, or at least we're lowering the risk of having any kind of a privacy violation. So now let's start to talk about, well, what will we include in a privacy policy? So this is where we have to really kind of admit to ourselves that most of us, we are not subject matter experts when it comes to the laws around data privacy. So we recommend you need to include your legal department with this. And if you're, a small company, then this is where you might want to talk to an attorney who has a specialty in privacy, so that since they are the experts, we're not making any bad assumptions when we create our privacy policy. So once we have a member of the legal department that can assist us, then we can start to think about, okay, well, what data are we collecting from our users? So what data are we collecting? What regulations even apply to us when it comes to data privacy? It depends on, where, what are the demographics of our users that we are collecting data from? Are we collecting data from children? Are we collecting data from students? Well, then, there may be regulations that apply to that. Is this healthcare information? Where are our users located? Are they located only within a specific state in the United States? Are they located in Canada? Are they located in Australia or the European Union? What data specifically are we collecting? Are we collecting personal identifiable information? Are we collecting geolocation information? Is this information we're collecting from our users telling us where they are located? Very different from personal identifiable information, but yet still very sensitive. That information could be abused if it was exposed to someone with bad intentions. Are we sharing this information with any third parties? The laws may apply to those third parties depending on where they are located. And then finally here, what is the time duration of the data existing within our databases, within our files, and do we have any kind of policy for the destruction of that data? So there's a lot to include in a privacy policy, and I hope you can see that it would be easy to make assumptions here about the laws if we aren't talking to someone with a legal background that can help us understand, how these laws are written and how they apply to us. So it's just best, we want to minimize the opportunities for making assumptions here and actually using a subject matter expert like an attorney to help us create these privacy policies. Large organizations, you may have a legal department where someone is actually right there to be able to help it with that. But small companies will have to hire someone outside the organization most likely. So the items to include, now this is kind of some of, I've already talked about these, but this is kind of adding more detail. But look at the number one here. What data will we be collecting? Will it be identifying data, so very specific to the user, or are we going to make that data anonymous in some way, perhaps by masking that data? How the data is collected is something we want to include, but we don't necessarily want to get too much into the details of the implementation of data collection, because maybe this is, we're writing this policy for an application that hasn't even been created yet by the developers, and we don't want to necessarily dictate to the development team how they need to write, their code that actually performs this functionality. But we do want to talk a little about the data collection at a high level. Let's see, anything else on this slide that I haven't discussed? I think number 5 here is important. Give an option of verifying, correcting, changing, or removing personal registration information to the users. Now, this is something that's required by GDPR, but we're seeing laws being passed by other countries and other states that are basically using GDPR as a model. And so perhaps this is just something, well, if we're going to write this privacy policy, we'll make sure we'll give our users the opportunity and the ability within the application to, correct if there's any mistakes to that data, change the data, update it, or remove it if they so choose. Give the users a way for them to opt out of future communications if they aren't interested. And then finally, the last point here, state that the policy will be updated periodically, because that's going to happen as laws change, and then explain to the user how we'll communicate such changes, whether it will be through email, or are we going to send them a certified letter, or what other kind of way we decide to communicate those changes. We're letting them know in advance. So when it comes to privacy policies, there are also cookie policies. So if you aren't familiar with cookies, so this is just data that is stored within the user's browser, but it is data that our software development team is using for many different reasons to run our application within the user's browser. Now, for this example here, having a cookie privacy policy is required by GDPR. It is recommended in other legislation, but specifically GDPR requires the user to consent. So they're giving us approval before loading any JavaScript to collect any tracking information of the user. So the user does have the opportunity to say they absolutely do not consent, which means that computer code never gets loaded into their browser if they say they do not consent. Also here, application creators are given an option to change cookie collection preferences. So they are given the ability to make changes in kind of the settings that are involved with the data collection practices. And as part of GDPR, we have 4 tiers of cookies. Here, strictly necessary, only for functionality, so remembering users' choices, tracking and performance. This is basically the Google Analytics that we often see applications using to send data to Google to kind of analyze, who's using their web application and, for how long and from what location. And then finally, the last one here is targeting and advertising. So now we're talking about kind of the Google features where they will collect information that will help them, target, advertisements to specific users. So we have GDPR that legislates, how and when we can store data within users' browsers. So we kind of want to take that approach and be proactive and say, maybe this is something that we need to do also. So, but I do want to impress upon you that we want to make sure that the privacy policy that we create is not something that only the attorneys understand. In fact, the GDPR requires information to be transparent and simple to understand for the intended audience. And the intended audience is not actually attorneys. The intended audience is the users of our application who happen to fall under that GDPR legislation. So we do need to consider how readable and understandable is our privacy policy. So that's something that we have to think about also. So another example here is mobile app privacy policies. Mobile app, it's very easy to think, well, they're almost the same as web applications, but it's always the differences, the small differences that can catch us up. So here's some privacy policy points that might be similar to web, where we could have identity, who is collecting the information, as well as the company's contact deals. It has to be part of the privacy policy. What types of personal data the app will collect and process, why the data is being processed, and what is the purpose for that data collection, and what rights the users have, including the right to withdraw their consent and then having their data deleted. So this is something that we could include in mobile app privacy policies, and this applies to us, according to our attorneys. But there may be more depending on which app store we are going to be using to attempt to sell our apps or at least allow them to be downloaded. And it depends. It's going to be different from the Android marketplace than it is from the Apple App Store. So, but you can kind of look at the difference here. So you are required by the Android marketplace to have a privacy policy if your Android app uses the camera or the microphone of the mobile device, and if it's designed for families or if it's designed for children. But you notice in the Apple, for iOS, the App Store, there's a lot more requirements. So we have to have privacy policy if it's made for kids, if it offers automatically renewable in-app purchases, if there's free subscriptions that are being offered, if it allows the user to register with the organization that created the app, if it accesses a user's already existing account, like maybe a Gmail account or a Facebook account, if it's going to collect any user data, if it's otherwise required by law. So the Apple, the App Store has a lot of requirements when it comes to, do you need to have a privacy policy before they will allow you to sell apps or upload apps for purchase from their store. So, I've mentioned already about notifying users about your privacy policy and actually giving them the ability to say whether or not that they give you the consent, give the organization consent to allow for the collection of data. But I just want to touch briefly on the difference between just notifying the user and actually receiving consent. So if you notice here in the slide, we have two, what's the word I want, kind of notifications that are sent to the user. But there's a difference between these two. If you look at the very bottom of each one of them, you'll notice them. The one on the left-hand side has an OK button, and the one on the right-hand side has an I agree button. So this is where we start thinking about what is the difference between notice, where the user just has to click OK, or where we have consent involved, where the user actually has to say, I agree with what you're doing and I'm okay with this. So we want to make sure that if the laws that are applicable to the data we're collecting are enforcing some kind of privacy processes, that we are using, we're offering the user the opportunity to give their consent, which requires the user to accept how their data is collected. Now, from years of clicking buttons in applications, yes, probably most users will just click on that button no matter what it says. However, the important part is we are giving them the opportunity to understand that we are taking their privacy very seriously, and yes, some of them, they don't care. They just want to get to the functionality. But others do, especially the ones in the, my fellow security and information officers, they do read these. So it is important that we ask for their consent, because if we're doing this correctly and according to, let's say, something like GDPR, we are not even allowed to load any code into their browser if they have not specifically granted consent to us. So we can't even do anything until they click that I agree button to download the code to their browser. Load the code into their browser so we can start executing and start collecting their data. So consent is really important, and for the users who do treat the privacy of their data as a priority, this is something where it'll actually give them a good feeling about our organization, that we are doing the right thing, that their data privacy is important to us. And this is something we want to be proud of. This is something that we can share with them and let them know. So I mentioned before that we want to be proactive about creating a data privacy policy, because we don't want to find out later that oh my goodness, the state that our organization is located in just passed a privacy law, and oh my goodness, it's going to take effect in 6 months, and we don't even have a list of all the data that our applications have been collecting. So, this is something that takes time. So we want to make sure that we're being proactive about this, because not only does it kind of remove some stress of trying to get something like this done really quickly and potentially making bad assumptions, but having a privacy policy can be used to guide the development of an application that is currently being built. It will help the developers understand, okay, these are pieces of the data that we absolutely cannot, be cavalier about how we store them and how we send them to a third party, that there are laws that tell us that this data must be protected, and that we can't just copy this data to multiple databases up within our cloud environment, that these users do have a right to be forgotten. And that means if they ask us to delete this data, we absolutely have to do that, meaning we have to know where every copy of that information is to make sure we're thorough about deleting that data. So we want to give ourselves the ability to be proactive about creating these policies, because it will help the development team into understanding how they need to design their data lifecycle and how to design their data processing. And so we're lowering the risk of members of the development team making bad assumptions about how to handle this data correctly and securely. So this, I understand, is, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this all the time? And certainly there are going to be times where we do find ourselves where the law's already been passed, we don't have a policy, and that now the countdown is coming, towards us at probably what seems like a very fast speed, and then we have to, we just have to do our best with the time we have. But if at all possible, creating a policy early is probably going to be the best way to do this. So that's something I'm going to recommend. And I understand that, boy, it's not like we need another thing on our plate that we have to be worried about. And in this case, it unfortunately is. So I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit of how creating privacies ahead of time can actually help the development team. And these are, we're going to just kind of walk through quickly these 7 principles of privacy by design. These are very high-level design patterns that anyone can understand when it comes to, how should organizations be creating software that has to handle their users' data that laws have deemed to be private. So the first one is We want to be proactive with our privacy decisions and not reactive. So we want to anticipate and prevent data loss events. So what this really means is we have to be aware that data breaches are an absolute possibility. They can absolutely happen at any time. So we want to make sure we have some kind of a disaster recovery, data recovery plan if this does happen. We don't want to wait for an event to occur before having a conversation, well, what should we have done? We don't want to close the barn door after the horse has already bolted. We want to have a disaster recovery plan for if something horrible happens. And let me give you an example of what I mean from my own personal experience. When I was an intern while getting my computer science degree, I worked for a company that had a website that stored a lot of data from users. And there was another intern from my computer science program, and I'm going to call him Marty because that's his name. And one day, Marty and I are in the office, and Marty says to me, how do I run a stored procedure from the command line on the production database? A very, what's the word I want to say here? A completely innocent question. So I told him how to run a stored procedure from the command line. And then he started typing into his computer. And he said, like this, and he hits the return button. And I'm looking at his screen, and all I see scrolling on that screen is drop table, drop table, drop table, drop table. And I said, Marty, what did that stored procedure do that you just ran? And Marty said, oh, I'm sure it's fine. It didn't do anything important. Well, 5 minutes later, it was like the building was on fire. People were running up and down the hallway outside of my office. And I thought, I have to go tell my boss what's happened. So I walked to my boss's office, and as I enter the office, every IT manager is standing and looking over my boss's shoulder at his computer screen. And I said kind of quietly, I think I know what happened. And they all turned to look at me. And I said, Marty did it. Because he did. So, yeah, Marty dropped all the tables in our production database by running a stored procedure that he probably should not have. Thankfully, though, we did backups every 24 hours, and we had tested those backups to make sure we could restore from them. So as part of our privacy policy, we had a data disaster recovery process, and it worked. It didn't mean that certain members of the organization were not angry with the interns. They certainly were. No, we got fired, though, which was good. And Marty's doing fine. Don't worry about him. He's a VP over at IBM, so he's doing just fine. So, but we want to be proactive and make sure that we don't hide from the fact that bad things can happen if we don't kind of do our best to lower the risk of protecting our data. Next, privacy by default. We want to make sure that if the customer selects all the default settings when they create an account with us, that we leave them in a secure state. Like if they create the account, they don't do anything different with the settings that they are allowed to change, that right there they are left in a secure state and that their data is protected by default. So it's not something that it's not the user's responsibility to change. So this is called privacy by default. We're making it as easy to the user as possible to protect their data. Next, we want to have privacy embedded into the design of the application we're creating, or the service that we're creating. So this isn't something that we're going to add on later, during different future version of the application or the service. This is something we want to design into the system, without diminishing any of the functionality, but it's built, it's integrated directly into the application. So now I do understand this is definitely something easier said than done, but this is also how we want to think about security. Security isn't something we want to add into an application after it's already in production. It's something we want to build in right from the very beginning. This is going to make it a lot easier for us to build privacy into the application in a more reliable way. Instead of trying to create Band-Aids where we just kind of notice a problem, oh, we have a privacy issue there, and we kind of put a Band-Aid on it. That's not how we want to do it, because normally what happens in that case is we're adding complexity into the application, and usually we're causing more trouble than we're actually solving. We saw that when Microsoft decided that, boy, we've got this cool browser named Internet Explorer, but we need to start adding security into the browser to help protect our users, and it didn't work very well. They actually had to just create a new browser from the ground up, and now we have Edge. So we want to do this with our own applications too. We want to build that application with privacy clearly thought about right from the very beginning. So also it's really important to understand that we shouldn't have to make trade-offs when we're talking about how do we accommodate privacy within the application, and that there's really no such thing as, well, we either have to be secure or we have to take into effect the privacy laws for the users. That's not how it works. Actually, privacy and security, they go together. Now, they're not the same thing. They're definitely different from each other, but they overlap. By having an application that is more secure, it is going to be easier for us to maintain our the privacy of the data. But we want to make sure that we know that it isn't an either-or kind of a situation, that this is something where both of them are equally important to us, and that we're not going to prioritize security over privacy or privacy over security. Next. So one of the first things that I often talk about in my application security classes is that I tell the development team members that security is a process. It's something we need to think about from start to finish, and data privacy is exactly the same way. We need to think about data privacy from the moment that we have collected the data, as it's being processed through the application, as it is stored in a database that may be located in a cloud environment, whether that's a public cloud or a private cloud. How long is that data retained in that environment? And when do we destroy that data, depending on how the laws apply to it? Is it 7 years? Is it 15 years? Maybe we're only allowed to collect it for a few months due to new legislation. So this is something where we need to think about data privacy from the beginning of the creation process of the application all the way through when we go to end of life that application. We have to think about data privacy. I kind of touched on this already, but we want to make sure that our users have an understanding of are we sharing their data with any other third parties, and also what other locations do we send their data. Now, this does not need to get down into the details of which databases internally that we're storing their data in, but we do want to show the users that we're trying to be open with them, we're being accountable to them, and that we are complying with whatever laws apply to us about how we treat their data. And so we want to be transparent about the system. So, and again, that kind of really goes into when we create that privacy policy, is it a policy that can be read by users who are not attorneys? Can it be, read by software engineers? Can it be read by accountants? Can it be read by any users who are using our application, so that they have a fair chance of understanding that this is important to us and we're doing our best job we can to protect their data, and here's what we're doing with it. So they have the opportunity to say, you know what, I don't think I want to be a part of this anymore. Please, delete my data or don't opt me into the program. So privacy has to be a number one concern for us, not only because of the laws, which is important, but also we're showing respect to our users. We want privacy to be a fundamental goal because there are going to be moments where we're the users and other organizations are going to be collecting our data. And so it would be very difficult for us to say, well, I expect them to do the right thing if we're not. And we have to recognize that once data is lost, it's gone. It cannot be protected again. It's already gone. And the example I give here is it's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. It doesn't work. So we want to be as proactive as we can and make sure we're doing as good a job as we can about maintaining the privacy of our user data and making sure that we're transparent with users on how we're doing that. And that actually makes us look better. That is going to make us more trustworthy to the user. And you may have experienced this with your personal data when it comes to social media applications. When you see social media applications get in trouble for not doing the right thing with our data, I know personally I don't trust them anymore. And so we want to make sure that doesn't happen to our organization. We want our users to trust us, especially if they're paying customers. We want to make sure they continue to trust us because that means they're going to continue to pay us. That's very important to us. So here's an example of a privacy violation that happened within the past few years. Now, if you're saying to yourself, that picture is blurry on the right-hand side, you are correct. You do not have to adjust your eyes. There's nothing wrong with them. This is blurry on purpose. What we had here was Citibank. They had this URL address. And you can, if you look at the URL address, you'll notice that it does say my account. So that tells me that the user has logged in successfully and they're looking at their account information and there's a number there in that URL address. I'm going to guess that's their account number. Now what happened here was a user became curious and they changed that account number by adding 1 to it. And they were then able to see another user's account information. And then they added 1 again to the account number. And they saw another user's information, and another user's, and another user's, and another user's. This became a data breach. Privacy was violated, and this is an application security vulnerability. So often application security vulnerabilities can then cause privacy violations. In this case, sensitive user data was exposed to a user who should not have had permission to see it. And this is a big problem. So I just want to make sure everyone understands about these security vulnerabilities and then how that can affect data privacy. So, whoops, I skipped my second example. So this is called an insecure direct object reference. Now, if you're not a software developer, that's not that important, but I do want to make you aware of, if you remember the Panera Bread data breach from, it's been about 1 year now, it was the exact same type of vulnerability. When a user logged into their Panera Bread account, in that URL address bar was their account number, and when they changed it, they were able to see another user's sensitive personal information. A security vulnerability led to a privacy violation. So these work together, unfortunately. Not every application security vulnerability will result in a privacy violation, but a lot of them will. So we want to make sure that we're lowering the risk of this happening to us by thinking about what data are we collecting? Do we absolutely need to store it? How are we protecting this data? How long are we storing it for? We can start to think about that before the developers create the application. So we can inform the development team, hey, here's the information we absolutely need to collect from our users and to store, but that's it. We're not going to be collecting and storing anything else because we don't need it. Because if we do, that could cause problems and create a privacy violation. You know, the development team is often not aware of that. They're not subject matter experts. You know, they will do a great job of writing their code functionally to collect that data, but they may be collecting things that we don't want them to collect, or they're collecting them and sharing them, and we don't want them to share that data. So we want to make sure that by creating that data privacy policy, we're actually giving them guidance. We're reducing the risk of them making bad assumptions about what data to collect and how to collect it. So just in summary here, we want our privacy policies to inform the users about what data is being collected and how it's being shared. We want to give our users the ability to change their data, update it, or completely opt out of our data collection program, maybe even asking of us to delete their data, and making sure that our users understand when does our data collection process start, when does our data privacy policy go into effect, and that we may change it in the future, and how we'll let them know we're doing that. Same thing when it comes to if we're storing any sensitive data within cookies, or are we having, using mobile apps? These may require us to create policies, requirements within those privacy policies that, have our users notified of what our policies are, and also they give us consent. And also, this is the very last, and this is in the summary, but it probably should have been touching this throughout the other slides. Privacy policy should be managed and maintained by a central role in a privacy office, which is great if you have a large organization who has a privacy office. If you're small companies, well, that's going to be a little more difficult. But we want to make sure it is someone's responsibility to manage that privacy policy, and it's their responsibility to maintain that privacy policy. This is a living document. It's not something that we can write, we can store in a folder somewhere, and we don't ever look at it again. This is something that's going to change over time because laws change over time. So it has to be someone's responsibility to manage and maintain that document. So there's definitely some complexity when it comes to creating these privacy policies, and I definitely recognize that. This is something that's not easy, but however, it is something that's really important. So hopefully, through the information today I've shared with you, that you've really kind of sensed that urgency, that this is a priority to our organizations, and that we do need to create a privacy policy. We need to have a subject matter expert like an attorney included in the creation of this document, and that by creating this document, we are helping the development team to lower the risk of making a bad assumption about what data should be collected and how it should be stored and how long it should be stored for. So I have a couple questions I see here that have been sent about the material today. First question is, if the policy to be forgotten is required by GDPR, does that policy, whatever that most restrictive policy, extend to U.S. citizens? And does this mean we have different policies for different users rather than a single cohesive policy? So that's a very good question, and it is one that comes up a lot. And so I would recommend, I'll start with the second question here about, do different policies, do we create different policies for different users? But I would say in this case, the simpler we can make our data privacy policy, the better. And so if it is at all possible to create a data privacy policy based upon the most restrictive laws that our users are going to fall under, or our organization will fall under, I would focus on that instead of trying to create multiple policies for different types of users, only to just make our job as easy as possible. I would rather shoot for the single cohesive policy And again, it's easy to say that's going to be, simpler than creating other policies. I believe it will be, because we only have to do, create one document. But, this may be a case where when we talk to an attorney, they say, in this case, we have to, by law, create more than one policy because this user is drastically different than another user, and we're collecting data from both types. So, I would say, talk to a member of your legal department, but I would say overall, I would go with a single cohesive policy unless I was guided otherwise by an attorney. Next question here. What is your view of the stylistic and cultural differences between the U.S. and the European Union? U.S. statements trend comprehensive, long, and contract-like, and are often treated like binding policies. The European statements trend high-level, focusing on providing essential transparency disclosures. And I definitely agree with you there. There was definitely a cultural difference because privacy is a really kind of a vague, big word where different cultures definitely treat that word and define it differently. And this is another situation where we have to have a member of a legal department help us to understand what are the differences in privacy as determined by United States law, European Union law, Australian law, New Zealand law, because the cultures are going to be different. And it's easy to just make an assumption, well, everyone thinks about privacy the same way I do or the same way this one law does. Well, we can't make that assumption because definitely while the GDPR, created by the European Union is definitely a model that many countries and states are kind of using to build their own privacy laws, cultural differences are definitely going to make an impact on those laws. So we're going to have that subject matter expert with us when it comes to creating our own data privacy policies and not relying on our own understanding of our local culture and having that drive our own the creation of our policy. I think that would kind of lead us down the road where it'd be more likely that an assumption would be made to get us into trouble. And I know I certainly, even as someone who has talked about this for many years now, I certainly wouldn't want to make a guess about, let's say, how perhaps the Chinese government treats data privacy. I may be able to make some educated guesses because I worked over there and I have some experience with the culture, but I don't want to be wrong. That leads not only could that lead to be in violation of laws, but there could be a monetary fine involved with these violations that could be very large. And I'm going to point back at Facebook again with the European Union. The European Union wanted to hit Facebook with a really big fine, and now Facebook is fighting that, so we'll see what that fine ends up being. But it was a very significant amount, at least in, I would say, most people's estimation. I think I've also seen where that was only like 15 minutes of profit for Facebook in 1 year. So, but it seemed like a very large amount of money to me. So, but definitely cultural differences are going to have an impact on how we create our privacy policy. So that is something to be aware of. And thank you very much for that question. That was a really good one. Let's see here. Are there any other questions? One more here. How do we not overwhelm the dev team with both security and privacy updates? Yes, that is definitely important. We don't want to overwhelm our dev teams. I say that as a former developer. You know what? And actually, that kind of goes. That's going to blend in well. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be sharing with you another privacy webinar where I actually talk about how do we add privacy into the software development lifecycle and what are the risks our development teams need to be aware of. And a short answer to that question, I would say, is baby steps, small changes so we don't overwhelm our development teams with trying to add privacy and security when laws change. So that was the last question I had. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate you being here. It is now 3 o'clock. I'm going to say, boy, I kind of stuck the landing on that one. So thank you all very much for coming. And just so you all know, the information will be shared with you from today's session, the webinar recording, and a copy of the presentation slides. And please come back on February 28th for my next webinar, Privacy, the New Software Development Dilemma. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.